Welcome back. This is Awkward with the Awkward Interviews. I have Ashoka Jegroo here. He's a journalist like myself, also a New Yorker, born and raised in Brooklyn. For about the last 7 years, he's been covering protests, police, and the policing of protests, as well as other forms of state violence against oppressed people and the fight against fascism. I mean, I would probably venture to say I haven't interviewed anyone yet who's as similar to me as this guy. Most of his reporting covers New York City, but he's also covered protests in DC and Philly, and even went down to Santiago, Chile. His work has appeared in the Santiago Times, the New York Times, and some of the favorites, The Appeal, Shadowproof, Common Dreams, Waging Nonviolence, as well as Gothamist. But he might be most well known for his live tweeting as Ash Agony. He goes right to where the protests are happening, and he kind of is the new form of journalism, of independent journalism and live streaming, where it's somewhat hard for some people to distinguish between the press and the protester, because, you know, unlike an old school journalist maybe who is focused on this false sense of objectivity, which is truly impossible. This guy is clear about where he stands and why he's covering what he's covering, and as a result, he's had his own run-ins with the police. Today, we'll be talking about what he's witnessed and experienced in New York City and elsewhere over the last 5+ years, or nearly 10 years. You know, issues that are very important to me, like police violence and the criminalization of the poor and people of color. His thoughts on abolition and what he's seen in that movement, at least in New York City over the years, what may have changed over time, the fight against fascism, whether it's state fascism or the groups that like to come into New York and march that get met with people like us, and also what it's like to be an independent journalist, the importance of indie media and the attacks on press freedom. But actually, I'm going to start by welcoming my friend here to the show and saying it's the 1-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd. They want to pass a George Floyd Act that wouldn't even make what happened to him illegal, and that gives $750 million more to the police. And Joe Biden is symbolically, ceremoniously meeting with George's family. But, you know, there's no substantive change. There's no dismantling of the carceral system or addressing police violence and impunity. You know, we are very much in the same place we were before George Floyd's murder. George Floyd wasn't the first to say, "I can't breathe," and he wasn't the last. And we do know that the man who's hosting him today is seen as the architect of mass incarceration, as the writer of the 1994 crime bill. So my man, thank you for being here. I appreciate you.
Pleasure to be here. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Let's start with George Floyd and what's happening today and across the country, not just today.
Yeah, I'm not even sure where to start, man. Like, well, I remember when George Floyd died last year, when the video first came out or whatever, I had no idea that it would kick off what it kicked off, really. Right. So, because I've been reporting on this since Eric Garner and Mike Brown, essentially, right? Well, a little bit before that, I remember Kimani Gray, when we had like a little riot here in Brooklyn over Kimani Gray or whatever. But back in those days, and before Black Lives Matter kicked off with Mike Brown or whatever, I remember watching the news and seeing individual cases of cops killing people around the country, and it would always be, well, that's just that town. Don't worry, that's just that town. well, let them handle it. We don't need to protest that because it's in that town or whatever. And it was like very alien. Every town was pretty much alienated from each other, essentially, every community. And then what Mike Brown, the Ferguson uprising, really like brought together was like a national consciousness. Like what happens in Ferguson happens in New York, happens in Minneapolis, happens in Oakland, happens in the whole damn country and around the world, essentially, everywhere that colonialism has touched, essentially. And so, but I remember 2014 when that happened, that kicked off, the whole wave of protests. And then it died down a little bit. People were still on the streets, and I was on the streets covering those protests, whatever, but it didn't have the big crowds, whatever. Then Philando Castile and Alton Sterling were killed in very brutal, vicious ways. And that kicked off another wave, essentially, a big protest. And then those died down. And the funny thing is, those first two times, the protest movement in part died down because someone killed some cops, essentially. In Dallas, cops got killed in 2014. Some guy came up from Baltimore up to New York and killed 2 NYPD cops, and then the press went nuts over it, whatever, and made it seem like, oh, look, this Black Lives Matter movement is causing the deaths of cops, these poor cops. But yeah, so those 2 waves happened, then died down. And so I was getting like really pessimistic about the possibility of like a revolution happening, like some real good uprising happening. Because those first 2 waves were really good. I remember 2014 being on the streets, taking over bridges was like a big deal here in New York too, I remember. And taking a highway was like, people were considering you violent just for like blocking highways and taking bridges back then, I remember. So at the time George Floyd happened last year, when he was brutally murdered, I remember seeing that video, and I thought it was horrible, obviously, but I thought it was just gonna be another case. I thought we're gonna be mad online a little bit. There might be a few protests on the street, whatever, like the same people who always protest, but it was gonna be nothing. And I remember seeing the video and also thinking like, man, if the people who are watching that video, who are recording there and watching it happen in front of them, if they had gone and like tore that cop off of him and like saved George Floyd's life, the media would have demonized these people to no end, and called them violent for stopping a murder. And I remember all thinking about that, like, when can people just step in with watching a murder? When can people just step in and just put their hands on a cop and get them off somebody and save somebody? Like, when are we allowed to do that? Like, and literally we had to wait till George Floyd died. Really, George Floyd had to die for a lot of people to start thinking like, whoa, like maybe we have to step in sometimes.
And maybe like people did think that, but we're terrified. Like,
yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Like, what's to say they're just not going to turn around and shoot you in the face? Like,
yeah. And then you'd be, like I said, you'd be demonized in the press for being the violent. You'd be the violent one for stopping a murder.
And it's interesting because I come from a similar background as you, and I had the exact same thought, or I've had these thoughts. Like, what was it? Like, why? Because again, he wasn't even the first person to be choked to death and use the words "I can't breathe." Wasn't the first one on video. So do you have at this point down, a year later, any thoughts on what it was? Because this was actually the longest period of sustained protest in our nation's history. That includes the civil rights era. That includes the Vietnam, anti-Vietnam War protests. It was nonstop for hundreds of nights. So why?
Well, I think the pandemic obviously played a substantial part, obviously, right? Like people are frustrated, stuck inside or whatever. I remember when the pandemic first started and everything was locked down and George Floyd hadn't happened yet or whatever. And I had become so depressed because I thought, okay, protests are done. They're effectively illegal now, essentially. I was like, I don't know how the state is going to use this into indefinite amount of time to like quell protests or whatever. So I thought our movements are done, essentially. And I was really depressed at first too. But I guess everyone felt the same frustration, and I guess after Black Lives Matter first started in 2014, that gradual frustration building up of nothing happening, and over again, case after case, Tamir Rice, John Crawford, like freaking just over and over again. And then here in New York specifically, it was I think there was logical progression and logical like procedure that things went through, I guess, because like right before the pandemic broke out and right before George Floyd was murdered, there was FTP protests here in New York, and those were essentially the most intense protests I had seen in New York at that time. And basically, people were calling those riots, and people were like, politicians and local business and the cops were like demonizing those to no end. I remember right before FTP3, the cops were saying that like, oh, they're threatening violence, these are terrorists or whatever, these people. And so those were like really intense, but those were like a very good like
precursor
to what the actual riots that broke out later. And like now that I think about it, like the people who were complaining about FTP protests were like, they had no idea what was coming, and like they should have been happy for those protests. They should have been appreciative of how mild they were compared to what happened later. But yeah, that slow frustration building up, I think was logical, I guess. And after years of just seeing it, and then like we're protesting, Black Lives Matter. We're saying Black Lives Matter for years. It's happening. And I guess the pandemic, people stuck inside, people get that frustration building up more, and then that video hits, I guess. And that video is just like heartbreaking to watch, you know, like, like I remember everyone brings up this part when he calls for his mother. When he calls for his mother's name, and then you find out his mom's been dead for a while. Like just thinking about what like that's just like heartbreaking, that part of the story, you know? That shit, anyone who wants to break shit after seeing something like that and then seeing that content, hearing that context, is totally reasonable in my opinion.
Right.
And
all right.
So yeah, I think those were a lot of those things like contributed to like that explosion. But like I couldn't see it happen. I didn't see it, and it happened, and it was amazing.
And I'm right. I agree. I'm glad it did. So I have a bunch of thoughts running through my head. I mean, on the one hand, you know, I've got video of federal agents in Minneapolis shooting potentially lethal paint canisters at people on their front porches who weren't even protesting, yelling, "Light them up." There's you know, federal agents with no badges literally kidnapping people off the streets in Portland. What happens in New York City leads to the attorney general actually, you know, suing the NYPD for their brutality in response to the protests. And we do see, you know, 20 or so cities defunding, you know, $150 million or something like that from police departments. And we're starting to see, because to me, the Black Lives Matter movement and the defund or abolition movement are inextricably tied, in that the reason that the term was popularized was a direct response to police violence, and there's a lot more to it, to abolition and everything. But after all that, after a number of cities making steps in the right direction, and of course, you know, without reallocating resources and without defunding down to zero, if you ask me, it's not true progress, but it's something. At the end of the day, across the country, police spending actually increased again in 2021.
Yeah.
So, you know, what are your thoughts on like to me, what seems like the performative BS of like Joe Biden hosting George Floyd's family?
Yeah.
And then in comparison to police spending increasing nationwide.
Yeah. Well, here in New York specifically, I mean, it's the local political establishment essentially is run by the Democratic Party, you know, by a lot of politicians who call themselves progressive as well, right? And for the last few years, it's not like activists haven't been pushing these so-called progressive politicians to cut the NYPD budget, cut the head count, to reduce their power, that stop broken windows policing, for example, right? And a lot of these so-called progressive politicians here in New York City will be like, yeah, we agree with you. Yeah, of course, we definitely want to do it. We're going to do it, trust me. And they never got around to do it. And they would always like raise the budget, increase the budget, and always find some new reason. And the Post and the New York Daily News would always find something to panic about. Like there was always something to panic about, why we needed more cops or whatever. And so, and that's what happened, I guess, in 2014, and every wave of this movement, essentially, like we'll get a little bit forward, and then like the mainstream media and the politicians and the cops will all get together, and the fascists online too. They all all these scumbags work together, and beat back progress. Essentially, the definition of reactionary, right? Just trying to beat back progress. And then, so I've seen this kind of like this game happen like a few times, I guess, in the last 6 years already. But superficially, there has been some progress of a kind, I guess, because I remember when in 2014 and 15, Bill de Blasio would talk shit about Black Lives Matter protesters and say like, you know, these people are extremists, whatever. I remember when we did the NYPD KKK, how many kids did you kill today? That chant back in 2014, 15. And they asked de Blasio about it, and he was like, "No, that's just the minority of protesters. That's just an extreme fringe. That's not the vast majority, whatever." And in reality, it was the vast majority of us like chanting that on the streets, whatever. So back then, like Black Lives Matter wasn't even considered like legitimate.
Yeah.
With the George Floyd, Breonna Taylor uprisings, essentially now, like people like Joe Biden have to like
acknowledge.
Talk respectfully about the movement and acknowledge it and treat it like as a legitimate political force now. So that's kind of progressive. It's superficial.
But that's a good point. That's a good point. You have to acknowledge Black Lives Matter. And they're saying the same stuff about, like, I mean, people, you know, the people that I'm talking about right now, like they can't even conceive of what abolition means, but they're saying the same thing about defund the police that they were saying about Black Lives Matter. Yes. There's a problem with the language. You know, we can't support that, you know, and Black Lives Matter, we can't support that, for instance, because it suggests no one else's lives do.
Exactly, yeah, exactly, yeah.
And then we can't say defund the police because we need police. And like, you know, we actually agree with everything you're saying, but because you're using what they're calling a hashtag defund the police, we can't support it because it's sending the wrong messaging. And you also brought up like the New York Post and Daily News, and those are right-wing rags, but you know, the so-called left among the mainstream media, the New York Times, like, you know, the NBC or MSNBC, whatever the hell it is, like all of the mainstream media is involved in perpetuating this propaganda. And, you know, and it's how at the times of the lowest crime rates, they were able to build more and more prisons than ever before, which leads me to why you're so important. And, you know, you are obviously one of a number of people doing this work. But from your perspective, like, you know, like for one, how did you get into this, and why is indie media so important in general? And then specifically as it relates to cop watching, countering propaganda, and covering protests.
Okay, so I guess let me start with how I got into this, like I guess my little history. So I went to well, I grew up born and raised here in New York, Brooklyn, or whatever, and I went to Brooklyn Tech High School, and I did the media major there. I had no desire to be a journalist or be in reporting or whatever. I wanted to like work on like TV sets or something like that. I wanted to make rap videos, basically. That's why I got into media. But
maybe we can talk about hip hop too at some point.
Yeah, word. Yeah, I used to spit. My Ash Agony was my rap name. That's how I got the name Ash Agony. That was
all right. Have you heard the 10 Demands song?
No, not hey, listen to it.
You gotta watch that video,
dude. The thing is, I'm old now, so I don't listen to actual music now. That's the thing. I watch rap battles here and there, but I'm like an old grumpy man who doesn't listen to the radio anymore.
I'm old and grumpy too, and they wouldn't put 10 Demands on the radio in a million years. This is right up your alley, brother. You got to
word.
But anyway, keep going.
The word. So yeah, I went but they made me. I remember I had to like write an article for the student newspaper in high school, or whatever. And I wrote an article about this guy I knew who did was really good at beatboxing. He would beatbox for us while we like rapped in the lunchroom and shit like that.
What was his name?
Kezron.
What's that?
His real name was Kezron, but I don't remember. I don't know if he had like a rap name or anything like that.
But
And
not
also,
someone I would have heard of. Okay.
yeah, no. It was just some guy I knew in high school. And I wrote another article about another guy who used to spit, because he was young. He was like a year or two younger than me, but I thought he was like fire. I was like, yo, this kid is fire. I gotta write an article about this kid for the paper. So like I wrote an article about it, and like my teacher loved the article because she thought it was like really nice and light and funny, and like it was really informative, whatever. And like I got a really good grade on it. So I was like, oh shit, maybe I got that little seed in my head, like maybe I could do this one day. But I still had no desire to be a journalist. So I went to undergrad. I went to Hunter for a year, then went to Stony Brook. I dormed out there, and I was a political science major out there. So I was like, and the funny thing is, I was a libertarian back then. I was a Ron Paul libertarian back then.
Okay. So did the college experience or the neighborhood experience, like, or the combination, radicalize you?
Well, even when I was like a Ron Paul libertarian, I hated the cops. Like,
when you weren't like a standard Republican, you like still had an issue with like authority and yeah.
My two big issues, and the reason why I considered myself a libertarian back then, was I was against the wars. I was against Iraq and Afghanistan, and I was against the drug war. Those was my two big issues.
Yeah.
And those affected people like me here and around the world, essentially, right? Like that's the way the government terrorizes people like me. So that was my reason for being a libertarian. But I thought I was like, look, if capitalism, we just like, just let the regulations go, equality will happen naturally. That's
the part you were missing.
Yeah, exactly. So I went to Stony Brook. By the time I got to like sophomore year or whatever, I was learning about the media. Like I learned the propaganda model, Noam Chomsky and all that stuff. And I really started like becoming more critical and watching the news much more, keeping an eye on it. And I was like, oh, okay. I started noticing like, Fox News is bullshit. Oh shit. CNN is bullshit. Oh shit. And then, so I remember I lost my capitalism essentially because one reason is I started reading the anarcho-capitalists, and then I was like, well, let me take this one bit further. Let's get rid of capitalism or whatever then, right? But but before that, I was like, let me read Karl Marx and debunk him in favor of capitalism, right? I'm gonna read Karl Marx, and I'm gonna show everybody where he's all bullshit. I'm gonna do the impossible right now. So I started reading Marx or whatever, started learning about alienation, exploitation, these concepts, whatever. And I was like, wow, this guy Marx has some good ideas. Wow, maybe I should like integrate this into my ideas, whatever. And then slowly, like, capitalism died. Me, the belief in capitalism died. And I read Bakunin, Crime Think, Kropotkin, Emma Goldman. These were the people who made me an anarchist or whatever. Bob Black, even though Bob Black has a lot of fucked up shit with him, but like the Abolition of Work, that piece also like really like pushed me towards anarchism. And then by the time I graduated undergrad, I was definitely a radical. I was an anarchist. I was very interested in media criticism and writing. I liked writing. So these things started to come together. And then after like maybe a few years after undergrad, there was like a deal for the CUNY Grad School for Journalism. Like my dad saw there was like a low price for like tuition or whatever. It was, and especially if you were like a person of color or whatever. So he was like, hey, you want to do that? And I was like, yeah, sure. And he was like, it's cheap. Like, it's relatively cheap. It's a deal right now. You can get a master's degree for not that much money. So I was like, shit, it won't hurt. Why not? Let me just go. So I went, and that got me the chance to go to Chile. Part of the program was during the summertime. It was like a year and a half. And during the summertime, you had to do an internship. You have to do it as part to graduate. And I was doing international journalism and media journalism. So doing basically videos and audio packages that you post online on stuff that's happening everywhere around the world and here. So I was like, let me go to, and I saw the student movement in Chile was kicking off at the time, like really in the streets hard. I was seeing news about it here on Democracy Now! So I was like, wow, Chile's popping off. Ain't shit happening here in New York. The revolution's here is dead in New York. Ain't no revolution happening here in America. So let me go to Chile. So I went to Chile, got to intern for the Santiago Times. They were really good to me. It was mostly Americans and Europeans, essentially, like young Americans and Europeans, mostly white people, writing about Chile, essentially. And we didn't get paid, really. I didn't get paid. Just the editors got paid. That's the only people who got paid of that
So
organization.
I know your story is probably not over, but
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you this anyway.
Yeah.
So first of all, before I even get to the question I had in my head before your story, one, like, what were your thoughts about it being a bunch of non-Chilean, predominantly white people covering the movement there?
Yeah.
That's the first question. And then the other, did anything stand out to you, look like in retrospect, comparing the movement here before and after your time there? Like, is any similarities or differences that you picked up on in the movements themselves?
Definitely. Okay, so the first question, when I got down there, I was just happy that they let me have a fucking job down there, essentially. And freaking, because I wouldn't have been allowed. The school, the CUNY also put down money to help me go and live there, basically, for like a few months. And so like, and they didn't cover the movement. They like, the funny thing is, even though these were relatively privileged white kids from around the country going, like, being able to go and do this kind of work or whatever, the editors were like really sympathetic towards the student movement down there, like really, and like they're really aware, like, yo, this place literally had fascism not long ago. Exactly. And like a lot of the fascists are still in control in like a lot of places. So it was good that they realized that, but it was like, you know, like it wasn't really left wing or anything like that.
Okay.
Just an acknowledgement that fascism is real in this country and that people need to fight it. And like, if a few windows got to get broken to fight it, so be it, essentially, right?
That's a step ahead of most of our mainstream media. So
yes, definitely, yes. But I definitely had a problem with like it being a whole bunch of white kids. Like I was like the only person of color there, essentially, except like maybe one or two actual Chileans,
right,
who worked there as well, too, right? So, but whatever, they gave me a chance, they gave me a shot, and it was a nice work environment, and they let me decide what I wanted to cover, essentially, right? They gave me a few assignments, but they also say, hey, Ash, you like this stuff? Go cover the movement, the riots, essentially.
Yeah, that's great.
But the funny thing is, like, a lot of the covering the riots essentially was kind of like a grunt work, because you get tear gassed and like sprayed with like the water cannons, and like it's a really, and then you have to go, I had to go back to the newsroom and then write an article about all that shit I just went through, covered in tear gas and shit like that. So I guess that was one of the reasons they were like, "Yeah, go ahead, sure, go ahead, cover that shit."
I mean, for those who don't understand this, like, this is not an easy job. Like,
no, definitely not.
You have dedicated your life to is actually dangerous. Just like, in case there's any question about that, like I mean, honestly, it's almost, I'm not certain it's not more dangerous than being a protester, because you, like, when I was involved in civil disobedience, direct action, I was on high alert. I knew exactly what to expect. When you're a journalist, oftentimes you have a camera in front of your face.
Yes.
and like, you don't know what's might happen to you.
Yeah.
So anyway,
that's another funny thing too. One time they sent me out to a student protest, and the student protest down there, like, they'll start off like a nice march, whatever, music playing, blah blah blah. But like clockwork, after the march is done, people start putting on their masks and like getting ready, and shit goes down or whatever. So they sent me out there, and they're like, here, they gave me an expensive DSLR camera. They're like, this is the only one our newsroom has. You better take care of this camera, right?
My God,
if it breaks, you got to pay for it. And I'm a broke motherfucker, so I could not pay for that shit. So I'm like carrying the shit. And then the Chilean cops. Excuse me?
Do you have it like in a bubble wrap or anything?
No, but no, I was literally carrying it like this on me.
Yeah.
And freaking so the shit starts popping off. I see kids putting on their masks, lighting fires in the street. I'm like, okay, it's about to go down. Then the Chilean cops come with their big ass trucks with the water cannons on top. And down there, they're called guanacos, which is like the word for the llama, because the llama spits.
Oh,
and
wow.
so it's a big truck that spits water, like stinky water, like tear gas infused water at you, basically. So they're called guanacos. And so like they're surrounding us, this big crowd. I'm in the middle of a crowd of students, and the cops are surrounding us, like cops on the ground in riot gear, and these big trucks with the water cannons surrounding us. And I got my camera like in the crowd, and then all of a sudden I hear "Lagua," the water,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
so boom, we're getting sprayed with mad water. I'm trying to cover this camera so it
Holy,
doesn't get sprayed with tear gas. What? So yeah, that's
great.
having the camera is you brought me back flashbacks. We're having
Yeah, well,
flashbacks.
I enjoyed that, like every part of that.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, like you, like the way you told the story, all of it, your movements, like that. You're, you know, you're not like I like talking to people that aren't putting on like a TED talk. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
you're real. And
No, this is real shit that was happening, man. Like, yeah,
right, right,
and I'm there not just like, oh my God, these Chileans are being repressed. I'm getting repressed too. Like shit, I'm
right,
getting
right.
water. And the funny thing is, right after that point, I was with a white girl from South Carolina, and she spoke way better Spanish than me too, though. So we were together, and like students are all running in different directions, trying to get away from the cops. The cops are coming, beating people. Cops on foot are beating people and stuff like that, forming that line. Same way NYPD does right now, basically.
Yeah.
Armor.
So is it
So,
not that different? It's like, is it more dangerous? Yeah, that's what I want to know.
so yeah, there's difference from what I've seen when it comes to cops, from city to city, much less from country to country.
Yeah.
There are similarities, obviously. Like when you get beat with a baton, it's the same everywhere,
Oh,
obviously,
yeah,
right?
right.
Yeah. But like really quickly, like NYPD, I feel like it's more handsy. They'll grab you and like throw you, or like they
Right.
like to be more hands-on. Whereas like DC police, for example, will more likely shoot stuff at you, like not bullets, but like the flashbangs and stuff
Yeah,
like
yeah.
that. Like they're less handsy than the NYPD. And Chilean police will just send in their military vehicles out there. The guanacos are a common sight at a protest in Chile. You're gonna get sprayed with a water cannon,
Period.
basically,
Yeah.
and hit with tear gas. But yeah, we were trying to go. Me and this girl were trying to go through a line of cops, trying to get down to get my ass beat because I look like a protester too. Like I wear my bandana. I'm a brown guy. I don't look like a white gringo protester or whatever unless I talk.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to get. I told this girl like, please talk to these guys, these cops in Spanish, and like tell them that we're press and whatever, so we can get through. And I was like, if you got to start crying, so we don't get our ass beat, whatever.
Yeah.
So she started putting on the waterworks like, please, and start speaking Spanish. Please repress. Please don't beat us. Like, can we just get through? Get through. And then finally, like, they let her. Like they're like, okay, come through. And so we had to. After that point, we're like, okay, shit, I guess we got to go back to the newsroom now and write an article about this and do a video about this.
Your heart's like pumping out of your chest. You got to go sit down and kind of consolidate all of that.
On the walk back, I remember I was, this was like the first time I had ever got like hit with tear gas and stuff like that. And like, I was sneezing like crazy. It made me sneeze, my eyes water, and my skin was like, felt burning like crazy. So I remember on the walk back to the newsroom, there was a lawn with the sprinklers going on. I had to go in the sprinklers and try to like wash this shit off of me before I go back in the newsroom. It was wild. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's like really an illustration. It's symbolism for like the work that you do. Like you know, you have to be resourceful.
Yeah.
You know, it's a lot of like relying on yourself and what you can get your hands on.
Yeah.
You know, like you're covered in tear gas, so you use the sprinkler you walk by. You know,
yeah.
And like, you know, in order, like, you know, because also while you've, I mean, for those who don't know too, like writing an article for the Appeal or any of these magazines, for, you know, just so it's clear, I'm not talking about the Appeal specifically, but these magazines don't pay well.
I'll say the Appeal does pay well. I gotta correct that. Out of all the outlets, and the Appeal's been going through some shit recently with their union and stuff like that. But like,
yeah, I saw.
Every time I've written a piece for them, I think they're the outlet that has paid me the best out of every outlet. And I've gotten like video bought by like NBC, these big companies that could pay me really well for like my videos.
Yeah.
The ones that pay me the best is the independent ones, like Shadowproof straight up asked me, how much do you want to get paid? How much do you think your work is worth? which was really, I never, shout out to Shadowproof for that too. Shadowproof is really great. Truth Out treat me really well, let me write what I want.
The editor.
But the Appeal paid the best out of everyone. They just got money, so they paid the best. But yeah.
That's really cool. All right. So maybe
But the big mainstream ones, they were the cheapest, stingiest motherfuckers. ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox News straight up try to steal my shit. Like,
yeah. See,
so yeah.
You know, it actually makes more sense that this has been your experience, you know, because you would hope that the publications that represent the values that we hold would that would translate to how they pay their writers and photographers and videographers. And so it wouldn't be that surprising that mainstream media would try to screw someone like us. So never.
And also keep in mind that I like Truth Out, for example, doesn't have a lot of money to pay, but for what they have, they paid very well compared to CBS, NBC, who I know you can look up their yearly revenues online.
Right.
And they could have paid me way more. They could have paid me like the Appeal paid me for stuff, but they don't.
Okay.
So yeah.
Well, I'm really
it's still very hard to make a living. Still very hard to make.
Yes. Yeah, but I mean, it's an interesting point that I don't think people know, and it's good to know. But yeah, at my end point, you know, because I really wasn't trying to call out the Appeal specifically, and I'm glad to know they pay well.
I just want to make that because truthfully, they are the outlet who's paid me the best out of all the outlets I've ever worked for. The most money I've ever gotten was from the Appeal. Yeah.
Yeah, and same with Shadowproof and Truth Out. Like, you write for the best, you know, which is cool. But again, like you said, and like I was getting to, like, you know, this is not something that people get rich doing. It's something they do because it's their passion and they believe in the value, the importance, especially given what most people are seeing. Like, it's like the only other, like, it's like providing this alternative option to the stuff we're fed that is not based on reality. So how does someone like yourself, you know, what is your day-to-day like, and how do you manage to, you know, cover costs even for the work you do and pay the bills so you can not starve, you know, have a house, a roof over your head?
Oh, and real quickly, one real quick difference between Chile, the movement there, and the movement here. When I was in Chile, the student movement and just the level of organization and political education that these kids had. Like, I remember going to a high school, and the kids had kicked out all the teachers and occupied the school and demanded free education. And I went to interview one of the students. This is like kids, teenagers, skateboarding on the school they just occupied, basically, and waiting for the cops to come kick them the fuck out, basically, right? And I interviewed him. This kid sounded like a fucking Poli-Sci PhD. Like, these kids are just, and one of the reasons I think is they went through actual fascism, like straight up raw fascism, like Pinochet, and their parents remember it and they remember it. So I think that was one of the main differences. And so they have much more organization. The students get down, they know when to get down. And also a very important thing is when the encapuchados, the kids in the hoods, the black bloc essentially are the kids who break shit. When they get down and they get demonized by the press or whatever, the student leaders, the more mainstream, moderate, they won't condemn, from what I saw, they wouldn't condemn the students. They will say, well, maybe if you give these kids free education, we'll have to stop breaking shit then. Like, maybe that's the real issue. We need free education.
Right.
And I thought that's such a big difference from here in America, because here, the more moderate faces of the movement will freaking sell out the radical wings, essentially, 100%. Very easily. But okay, back to day-to-day living.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you brought that up too, because I think, you know, we're not you and I, but we in America are, sorry, I'm removing a cat from my head. We were, all right, I don't think there's multiple cats on
let them rock. Let them rock.
Well, normally I do, but because I have this background, it just looks weird. You know, you only see like parts of cats. Anyway, so you know, we're arrogant in this country, and I'm glad you brought it up that, you know, we have a lot to learn about organizing from Latin America, from Europe, from Africa, etc.
Middle East, Turkey.
Oh my goodness, and like Tokyo, you know, like Asia. So, and then also, you know, I think I think it's interesting too that you know, they wouldn't, the more moderate, so to speak, don't condemn the more radical. It's something that I talk about a lot when people tell me, you know, change your language when it comes to abolition. You know, or, you know, make your demands less significant. Look at this cat on my head. Oh my God.
I love it. No, I like it. Keep it.
How could you take me seriously right now?
This keeps eyes on the screen because my eyes are fixated on the screen right now.
All right,
and I'm paying attention very hard right now. So go.
Good. Well, maybe I should just glue her there.
Yeah.
All right. So, you know, but and so what I say all the time is like, you know, in order for the civil rights movement to be successful, in order for the Civil Rights Act to be passed, for them to listen to a man they feared and hated like Martin Luther King, they had to hate and even more fear Malcolm X and the Black Panther Party. So you have someone like me who's saying like, I want all cops gone. I want all prisons closed. I want everybody freed. And I do intend to reach that goal at some point. You might be more likely to listen to the people who are saying defund this department by 50 million this year and then 50 million next year. You know, so that's another part of like, you know, the people who are having the conversations with city councils, the people who are being interviewed are not the same ones who are necessarily breaking windows and wreaking havoc on the streets. So, you know, it's good to see there that those people are, you know, owning their position and not condemning what the more radical people are doing and kind of hinting at the fact that like, while we may not be in control of these people, if you continue to have these conversations with us and listen, maybe they'll stop doing the stuff that's really freaking you out.
Yeah, exactly. And if we can make that, if we could generalize that and standardize that here in the US in the movement, like freaking don't punch left, essentially. Don't like the Black Bloc and people breaking windows and lighting shit on fire are creating space for you
Yes.
to be able to even say all this stuff, you know what I mean? So
exactly.
Yeah, and Malcolm X said it himself later on in his life. He said, like, I made Martin Luther King respectable. Freaking these white people were scared because we were calling them all devils. So it made freaking King respectable. And that's exactly how, you know, that side, that the more moderate face of the movement should look at it.
Yep.
But here, for example, we have people like Tamika Mallory and Linda Sarsour and the Justice League or the Women's March or whatever, right? I remember the day after J20, when after the inauguration day for Trump, when a whole bunch of people got arrested, I went to do court support the next day. And there was a whole bunch of like, you know, people outside the courthouse waiting for people to like, you know, get out or whatever, waiting for people to like get free. And then a whole bunch of Women's March people were marching by and we were trying to tell them like, look, this is what happened. They're like, what? We didn't even hear about that. Oh my God, they broke windows? Oh my goodness. But okay, so maybe they deserve to be in there or whatever. Like,
really?
Yeah, I'm like, what the hell, guys? Are you kidding me? And then like, you guys will be the same ones to say you're the resistance or whatever. And basically that's what happened for the next 4 years after that, right? That resistance movement was a fake ass resistance movement. But like, yeah, if for example, if the Women's March, for example, were to come out and had said from the beginning, we stand in solidarity with the J20, we want Trump down, stuff like that. Right. The movement against Trump would have been much stronger, I feel like.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, you know, and I'm not going to bring in the ethnicity or religion of, you know, the people that you mentioned or who might be associated with the Women's March. So because I don't know if that might have anything to do with it, but just in general, whether it's, I just think it's worth noting that some of the people who are willing to express solidarity with Palestine, with Palestinians, and movements outside of this country are less likely to do it in their own backyard.
Yeah.
What Palestinians are willing to do is the stuff they're afraid for us to do, it sounds like.
No, it's fun. Like Linda Sarsour, for example. Linda Sarsour would chant resistance is justified when people are occupied, right? And in Palestine, long live the Intifada. And I agree, long live the Intifada, right? Free Palestine.
Yeah.
But when people was, you know, breaking shit here and punching cops on the bridge in 2014, 2015 or whatever, the Justice League did their best to like distance themselves from those actions or whatever, and said, oh, that's not how we do. We're a nonviolent movement. And just like that emphasis on we're the nonviolent ones or whatever, it's just like it's sus to me as hell. It's sus to me as hell. And Tamika Mallory is another one, right? She worked with Al Sharpton back in the day, in National Action Network. And Al Sharpton, another person who's professional repressor of the movement, essentially, right?
Yeah. I don't know if you could sense it from my face. Like Linda, I know. And so like and I respect her and appreciate her. And that's why I'm like, I'm just really curious about what you know that I don't, and what experiences you've had with her. And honestly, you know, just what you've said about the Justice League, you know, it's disappointing to hear. I clearly, you know, none of us know everything. As a New Yorker, I probably should have been aware of this. It was probably right out in front of my eyes, but I didn't know it. The other, you know, anyone affiliated with Sharpton, from what I've heard of Tamika Mallory, that doesn't surprise me at all. You know, and I believe that Linda's open to criticism. I believe that, like, I, as her friend, need to encourage it. This is how we grow. I'm just, you know, I find the more you can tell me and us, the better, because I think this is a message she needs to hear, that we don't gain power by splintering and not supporting each other.
A good article to read that was written back in, I think, maybe 2015 about this is written by Raven Rakia and Aaron Cantu, who are working with me on Copwatch Media. They wrote an article back about the Justice League right when the movement here in New York, the Black Lives Matter movement here in New York, was kicking off. They call it the Fight for the Soul of Black Lives Matter. It was written in Gothamist, and everyone should definitely read that article. They interviewed basically the people from the radical wing of the movement and people like the Justice League, the more moderate wing of the movement, and essentially like did a really good critique of them. And that was a few years ago. They did this article, so, and it's only gotten worse, I think, in the years. And I think they're not unique. It's not like Linda and Justice League are uniquely, like, they're part, I think, of a grander ecosystem of moderate groups meant to like kind of quell the more radical side of the movement, essentially. Like the Ford Foundation has been doing this for decades, right? They're like saying we support reform and blah blah blah, but then meanwhile trying to water down the radicalism as much and fight back against radicalism as much as possible, while fronting like, oh, we're the friendly, happy face of reform and blah blah blah. And I think it's almost collaboration with the state at some point, essentially, like to repress the movement and keep the radicals out of, you know, mainstream discourse, keep them from getting access to mainstream discourse. Like they basically hold back abolition from being the talking point, basically, right? And essentially defund essentially does that as well, right? When I learned about abolition defunding the police, it was all like from groups like BYP and stuff like that. BYP 100 is the concept was, we're gonna disinvest from police and the state and invest in the communities. Divestment and investment. That was the two things, and it was always together. These were always like put together, and that was essentially the process by which you abolish the police, right? Which is, and defunding is obviously disinvestment, right? And that was how I learned. And the fact that defund became like the main thing arising from the George Floyd uprisings, I was like, well, you know, defund is part of it. That's part of the process, yeah. But that's the goal is supposed to be abolition, right? And essentially, focusing so much on defund kind of like holds back abolition from being, you know, the main part of this conversation. And if we talk about abolition, we can also talk about defunding, right? Because that's how we get abolition, right? So if we center abolition, I think that's the most strategic thing to do, whatever. But like the more moderate groups, like, you know, and people, Tamika Mallory is not even a socialist or an anti-capitalist, as far as I know. So like, we definitely ain't abolishing the police with her, like that. So essentially, the role of these people, from what I've seen, is essentially like hold back the radicals,
position themselves as the faces of movements in order to like advance their careers, essentially. Like I joke with people, like, don't be surprised if we see council member Linda Sarsour in like 10 years or whatever.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised by that.
So like, yeah, and like I said, the same shit that like Al Sharpton is, the same hustle Al Sharpton has done for a while, you know, like position himself as the face of movements of the justice movement in order to like gain a position for himself and prominence for himself. Now he works for MSNBC and he's a freaking literal snitch, you know. So like, so yeah. But like I said, they're not unique, and so I don't want to put too much attention on just them, because there's people who have done that since the George Floyd uprisings as well, right? We saw a whole bunch of opportunists come out of nowhere, people who are models on IG, all of a sudden leading protests or whatever. Like, so yeah, we have to watch out. We have to watch out for those type of people.
Yeah, I totally agree. So back to the original question. I'm glad you brought up abolition.
My bad.
No, I mean, this is just a good conversation. That's what happens, you know. And I do think, just for what it's worth, obviously as an abolitionist, I believe that abolition needs to be centered in the conversation. And there just needs to be a lot more education alongside the direct action, the voting, the conversations, things like the 10 demands, putting those in front of elected officials, you know, cop watching, court watching, showing up at town hall meetings and demanding these changes be made. You know, at defunding is, as you said, going to lead to abolition. And for those who know, defunding goes hand in hand with reallocating. You don't just take money from the cops and gamble. Like, I mean, like, what do they think we're doing with that money? Like, the whole idea is that we're putting that money into something that's actually going to make us safer and healthier and address the underlying causes.
Yeah. And that's always, like, even before defund the police was a thing, was a slogan, like I said, like protesters who were doing this already, like BYP, and I remember we did Occupy, shut down City Hall NYC before Abolition Park, years before, when we tried to get Bill Bratton out of the NYPD. That was also one of the demands, like divest from the NYPD and invest in communities. That was one of the demands. That's always been, and they've always been linked together, these two things. So yeah, they can't be decoupled. And like you said, like, defunding is not the goal. It's the method by which we achieve the goal, abolition.
And we need to make sure, for what it's worth, that we don't allow a celebration of manipulations of defunding, like they did in our city, where they literally just moved what they call school safety officers, which is just the militarization of our schools, from the police budget to the education budget.
Yeah, and then touted that as a cut, touted that as a budget cut. Yeah,
they were able to tout an increase in the education budget and a decrease in the police budget without doing anything
but slapping a new patch on the cops, essentially.
Yep, maintaining the system that creates the school to prison pipeline. Mm-hmm. So let's close out with I
didn't get into the day-to-day stuff too.
Exactly. Yeah. So let's close out with what it's like to be in a position like yours, and you know, what you have coming up and how people can support you and all of that stuff.
Okay. So definitely I have to plug Copwatch Media, this new media project that me, Joseph Trujillo, Dennis Flores, Raven Rakia, Aaron Cantu, we all came together. We've been thinking about this for a while, and we were like, fuck it, let's finally make it happen. We're tired of seeing basically mostly white, freaking affluent reporters reporting on our communities and basically how our communities are oppressed. And basically the dream of this site, and basically it's to have people from our communities, you know, Black and brown youth, report on what cops are doing, record cops, write on them, do all kinds of media exposing and combating racist police violence in our communities. And part of the dream is to basically get this thing going. What I want to do is train a whole bunch of young kids to do this, become reporters, be community reporters essentially, and then just hand it off to them, and then have this thing like run and have it become like an institution among like young people, young radicals.
I love
Like,
that.
yo, we have an outlet for ourselves that we can write about this stuff, and we can like, hopefully we want to get it reader supported eventually, but right now we're all broke ass people. So right now we're basically begging rich white liberals for money to fund this thing, Copwatch Media. So if you know any rich white liberals, people out there who have money to spare, tell them there's a media outlet started by Black and brown people. And if they really committed to Black Lives Matter, like they said last year, like a whole lot of liberals said last year,
Yeah.
throw some money, throw some big money at us so we can pay Black and brown young people to report on their communities. So that's first of all, Copwatch Media, check it out. It's on Twitter and IG. But for me personally, it's been a freaking struggle to do this work, man. I don't make a lot of money. I definitely don't make a lot. And you don't get into this work for the money, essentially. My main sources of revenue are basically selling videos, and that doesn't happen often. The most money I ever got for videos was when Fox News stole 2 of my videos. Tucker Carlson and Laura Ingraham stole my videos, and I had to basically like get a lawyer on deck and send them an invoice and a letter, get in contact with their financial part of the company, whatever the finance is, and tell them like, hey, look, I have a record of asking for permission first when people use my stuff and I sell my stuff. You didn't ask for permission, so I'm charging it an inflated price right now. So I inflated the price like crazy for Fox News because they had already used, it's no use taking it down because it had already been seen.
Yeah.
So that was the most money I ever gotten for videos. Other times I get like maybe like a few $100 for like a video here and there from for NBC or ABC or RT. RT is like really cheap actually too. And then also articles, right? Like I said, the Appeal paid me the best, but like you get paid a few $100, maybe $1,000 for an article. And it takes a lot of work.
Yeah,
it takes, you have to do interviews, you have to, you know, go send emails to the authority figures and ask them for their comments or whatever, so you can say, oh, they didn't respond, whatever. It's just a whole lot of like chasing people down and then putting it all together, then going through edits, and then yeah, that's a lot of work for a few $100. And then Patreon, right? And I've just started my Patreon. I was like, I used to feel really icky about Patreon, but it's become a point where I need it. Like I've been going through a lot, especially since the pandemic started. Financial situation, living situation, family drama. It's just been really like making things hard and makes this life really hard. So yeah, for journalists like me, it's not easy getting by, and we do the best I can, basically try to survive. And so yeah, every dollar you donate to me or Patreon is very much appreciated, and it literally does go to feeding me, housing me, getting me from point A to point B. I don't have a car or anything like that. I'm a broke motherfucker. So like every dollar you give to me literally goes to keeping me alive. Yeah. So please try to do that if you can. But like I'm not the only one. Yeah. And I'm pretty well off compared to like a lot of other like independent journalists I've seen who just, all we have is our phone or a camera we bought years ago, and we try to make best with what we got, try to get the truth out there. And because the reason why I did this is because I was so sick and tired of seeing lies in the mainstream media all the time about our movements. Like back in 2014, I was just like live tweeting. One of the reasons I started live tweeting was essentially to help other marches, because there'll be a whole bunch of marches going on in Manhattan at one time. And so for us to be able to meet up together, I'd be like, oh, march here at 30 something street or whatever, and we're marching north. And the other people in the other march would see that on Twitter. Yeah. We'd all coordinate and we'd all meet up, have a big ass march and take the streets. And it wasn't really reporting. It was essentially like help me strategizing with other protesters, essentially, to get our. But then I remember the way Black Lives Matter was just demonized and smeared, and the politicians and the cops and the mainstream media just smear the protesters nonstop and said outright lies about what the cops did. And it just pissed me the hell off. And I was like, look, I got a journalism degree. Let me put it to use. And let me start doing this to get the fucking truth out there and banging on these on this system, right? Basically. So that's why I basically started doing what I'm doing. But obviously you're not going to make a lot of money doing that. I mean, shit, the New York Times, AP just fired somebody just for being a part of SJP in college, just for that.
That was real crazy.
So yeah, that alone should tell you that like being a radical and being a journalist is definitely not a money maker. So yeah.
No,
so,
it's very true. And you know, if you've made it through what I think has been one of the more entertaining and interesting conversations I've had, you know, and you've heard this guy's pitch. This is, you know, this is very different than someone asking for mutual aid on Twitter and you don't know who they are and they're just pulling at your heartstrings. There, you know, 40 million people in this country go to bed hungry every night.
Yeah.
There's just, you know, there's mutual aid groups all over the country. There are ways to give back. But the work that this person and his friends are doing is so important in getting the truth out about these 40 million people and everybody else who's being crushed by the system. Any money you have that you can support his work, please do so. Again, it's Ash Agony on Twitter, and it's actually copwatch.media. That's the website. So you can learn more about him and Aaron and Raven and the other people he's working with. Thank you so much, man. I feel we could talk forever.
Yeah, man.
Be the first person I invite back.
Word. Well, I'll be glad to come back. Trust me.
Cool.
Trust me.
I appreciate it. I'm booked through October, so it'll be sometime after that. But keep doing the work you're doing. I really appreciate you. And one of these days we'll run into each other in person.
Word, man. Thanks for having me on. Thanks so much.
All right, brother. Peace.
Peace.